As we get closer to the end of the semester, we take a look at the corrections system that we have in the United States, both for adult and juvenile offenders, and the policies associated with it. I skipped one of the reasons I skipped over corrections and pushed it to later in the semester was because so many of the other topics that we've covered up until this point really kind of feed into the problem of law violations and deviance and that kind of thing. And so I just really felt that it makes more sense to have this later in the semester so you can consider some of the policy discussions we've had regarding other topics during the semester when we consider this particular policy topic. Now, first of all, just to clarify a couple of things, kind of the old sociology instructor in me wants to point out a couple of things about the terms, a couple of the terms that we use in this talk. One is deviant. A deviant, that word has negative connotations associated with it, and in fact, for the sociologist, as a sociological term, deviant behavior really is a very neutral thing, and really there's no implication of right or wrong with it. It just simply implies that that there's a behavior or a state that varies from the norm. So the norm is something that's defined by your culture. Sometimes it's defined by your context, and so what we consider to be deviant really depends a lot upon the culture and also the context in which any behavior occurs or any state exists. And so it's going to vary in different situations. Um, I like to use the example, and forgive me if I repeat this, but years ago there was the Peninsula Clarion, our little local paper in Kenai, had I think kind of had a slow news week and really kind of focused on this. During a high school football game, um, there was a streaker that ran out into the middle of the football field during halftime or at some point, nude, had a you know sock cap over his head or whatever, so nobody could identify who he was or whatever, and the response to that was the community, by and large, not everybody, I will say, but by and large, the community kind of took that humorously. The reporting of it in the news sort of had a kind of a comical kind of edge to it. The streaker was identified, and some consequences, and I don't really remember what they were, but there were rather severe consequences were applied by the school, and there was a lot of uproar in the community about that. That they felt that the consequences were overboard and really weren't warranted. It was just kind of a fun thing. All right, whatever. Now, take the situation. During the Vietnam era, when I was in college, streaking was kind of a thing that was actually happening fairly often, and I think there were a lot of theories about that, but I think it was a lot of theories were saying that things were so tense and nerve-wracking in those days that that the human beings were looking for ways to kind of lighten the atmosphere and whatever, however you want to describe it. But it was a kind of I wouldn't say commonplace occurrence, but it happened enough that you know, well, it just happened more often than it does today, at least in during those years, and generally it was just kind of accepted as kind of this fun thing. People, the big thing was trying to figure out who the streaker was. Well, take that situation, somebody kind of say running through a dining hall, a cafeteria in a college dorm, nude, and getting everybody laughing, and take that person uh, strolling through the hallway, say, of your classroom building on campus at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The consequences are going to be very different there, and the response to that's going to be very different. People are going to pick up the phone, call campus police. He'd probably get arrested, and I'm assuming it's a he, and be fined, put in jail for a period of time, perhaps. Might be accused of sexual offenses, that kind of thing. And again, in particular, in the more modern era, it's not considered quite so lightly. And so there's an example of how context can really change what is really a similar behavior, and yet we respond to it very differently depending upon the time, the setting, the context. And of course, in some cultures, nudity is much more accepted than it is in our culture as well. So, in any event, varies depending what is deviant really is defined by the group and the time. And so, whether it is considered to be a mental health issue, a law violation, a sin, or just kind of comical or different or odd behavior, really depends upon the culture and the context. And very importantly, who is in charge? Because the people who are in charge are the ones who define the norms. And so, who is in charge? Well, again, it depends upon what situation you're looking at. But if you're looking at the laws, the people in Congress, the president, those people are in charge. Heavily male, heavily white, heavily moneyed, that kind of a thing. So they also have something to do with what's considered deviant and what is not. And that's sort of a theme to keep in mind as we talk about some of the issues related to criminal justice policy in the United States. And another interesting side note, by the way, when you talk about the role of churches and religion in defining deviance and how deviance is dealt with, one of the functions of the church really is to reinforce the moral order of a society. And for the mainstream churches, the larger churches in a society, the things that are considered to be sins in those churches generally are also considered to be law violations in a larger society, and vice versa. It's just kind of an interesting little side note there. Now, so that's one thing about how you define deviance. The other thing is how we define minority status. And when we think of minority, a lot of times, of course, the average person is going to say, minority depends upon who outnumbers the other group. But that isn't the case. And I think, this group listening to me here is well aware of that. The minority isn't about numbers, it's about relative power. So, for instance, women, although they outnumber males in the world and in our society, they are nonetheless a minority because our societies generally are patriarchal in nature, and so men maintain more control and more power in those societies. So that's another thing to keep in mind. It's not about numbers, it's about relative power. And remember, power resides in the hands of the individuals who are also defining what is deviant. So deviance really becomes an issue of social justice, as the text points out very early in the chapter, because poor people and minorities are, as we'll talk about here, they're disproportionately represented among those held in correctional facilities and mental hospitals. Now, this doesn't come from the text. This is actually from the Pew Research website, and I don't know what year this is based on, but you'll see here the figures differ from what's in the text. And I just want to say, by the way, if you run into a test question about, the number of people in the United States per 100,000 that are incarcerated, you refer to the text, not to my lecture slides, okay? Because I'm bringing you some more current things. As I've pointed out a number of times, the text is a little behind the times in some of the things that it quotes. So anyway, even when the text was written and today, the U.S. has an incarceration rate that's far higher than virtually all other countries, and this demonstrates here. This is the incarceration rate per 100,000 people of any age. So this number is going to be lower than if you're looking at the incarceration rate of adults, because this is people of all ages. So sometimes the variations in numbers have something to do with how you're defining the group. But as I said, table 14.1 in the text is the one that looks at incarceration rates actually from 2006, and incarceration rates have declined since then in the United States. But so they vary some, but probably because of how the sample is described. Now, this is also from the Pew Research site. I just thought it was interesting that the American incarceration rate fell in 2016 to the lowest level in 20 years. And you can see here that now we're looking at the incarceration rate per 100,000 U.S. adults, not all ages, but adults. So the number is higher, and there it is, 860 per 100,000, and the number in the text is 700 something. And so, but again, that reflects figures from I think 2006, which if you kind of look at the graphs here, it probably, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't quite line up, but in any event, you get the notion here that we incarcerate more people in the United States, including the text says at one point second only to Russia, but the statistics all point to the fact that we're incarcerating more people than even Russia does, and maybe Russia isn't the evil empire anymore that we want to think it is. I don't know. But at the end of 2016, there were over 2.2 million people behind bars in the United States, including 1.5 million under the jurisdiction of federal and state prison, and roughly, about 750,000 in the custody of locally run jails. So that amounts to a nationwide incarceration of 860 prison or jail inmates for every 100,000 adults aged 18 or older. Now look a little bit at some of the historical trends in criminal justice, and just refer to, say, pre-scientific times. The text refers to some of the kind of harsh and barbaric kinds of responses there was to deviant behavior, and that was largely because the deviant behavior is really considered to be because of some sort of evil possession by the devil, or evil spirits, and that type of thing. And justice could be very swift and very very certain in colonial days in particular. That came Some of that came over from Europe with the colonists, and this is an illustration of the witch trials. As a witch trial, I should say, is one example of that. So the groups some of the groups began to respond to the kind of the harsh treatment of criminals, such as the Quakers. And Dorothea Dix is, of course, she as we know, she campaigned for better facilities for the mentally ill, but also did the same thing for criminals as well, arguing for more humane facilities. There was an age of enlightenment in the 1700s, according to our history books at least, and this notion developed that human beings were perfectible, that we could improve, we could change, and so the notion of like this swift and cruel justice kind of fell into disfavor some, and the philosophy for corrections that kind of developed out of that is that crime should be measured in severity, prevention being more important than punishment, and eventually, we got to a point where we were looking at rehabilitation also with our prison system. At least we thought we were. The purpose of punishment was to deter, not to seek revenge. Now, this is theoretically, and also that incarceration. One purpose of incarceration was to segregate prisoners from the larger society so as to not exacerbate lawlessness. The notion of probation is talked about in the text also as something that was an American development, and developed, I think, in the 1840s or whatever. Was found to be a less expensive way to deal with criminals, and the fellow who developed that kind of instituted a program of supervising them and monitoring them in the communities. Now, although I don't think that this is probably the typical face of what Lombroso was talking about, there was a development of, and I say that because this guy's white, and you just don't tend to think of that white facial features as being associated with criminality, and most of these and that is not, I'm not saying whites aren't criminals. What I'm saying is that the theories, describe a different kind of a facial structure that is more of a minority. And Europe, this whole theory about how there was anthropological criminology, that people were born criminal, was developed by an Italian by the name of Cesare Lombroso. And he believed, and he theorized that criminality was inherited, and that you could identify by looking at physical features and things like that. You could identify a person who was going to be a criminal just based on their appearance. Now, this notion never really did take hold very widely in the United States, thank goodness. But there have been theories in the 20th and even the 21st century, and this link here will take you to not that Psychology Today is an authoritative source by any stretch of the imagination, but take you to a relatively recent article about advancing the notion that criminals really do look different from non-criminals. According to this theory, I was a little surprised to see that in this day and age still, but I cannot remember the name of the, and I believe he was a psychologist or a criminologist of some sort, and I want to say his name was Jenner, but I looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't come up with this person's name, but there was a theorist in the 1960s or 70s, I believe, who also held to the notion that there were criminal features that you could tell by by looking at a person. And what I think this person did was he went to prisons around the United States and took measurements of the person's face and things like this, and came up with this theory. Well, what we know, of course, is that the prisons are overpopulated with minorities, so the criminal type looked very much like a black person in his theory. And his theories were, I think, pretty well rejected. They were given consideration, but were rejected by the scientific community. I wish I could come up with his name. We talked earlier in the semester also about the eugenics movement in relation to the mental health treatment of the mentally ill, and likewise, this applied to the criminals as well. This notion that deviance was genetic, and that the human race could be improved by sterilizing individuals who exhibited deviant behaviors, whether it be mental illness or criminal behaviors. And so, as we've talked about earlier, by the middle of the 1950s, something like 58,000 mental patients and convicts had been involuntarily sterilized, and this practice was upheld by the Supreme Court. Now, of course, Hitler, both in terms of the, using the facial features to define a person, that was a part of Hitler's theory about the master race. And actually, that's why I think the person that we just looked at, probably fits more of Hitler's idea of the master race than the criminal. Also, Hitler was, his theories really developed out of eugenics as well. So the world saw how that these kinds of scientific theories and beliefs could be misused and carried much too far. There, I think that's one of the things that helped to kind of stem the tide about things like involuntary sterilization. And then, of course, by the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, helped to call attention to the fact that those the victims of sterilization were often minorities of color and women. So the nation began to come to realize that the number of people that were incarcerated in our prisons and our jails were minorities, and I think it just kind of caused our society to begin to take a look at this notion that crime being an organic factor, might have some other reasons behind it, but that was a part of the debate, I suppose. We began to recognize that minority populations were being victimized by social injustice, thanks to the civil rights movement and the consciousness raising that occurred with that. Now, the cost of criminal justice is very great, and as the text points out, like the mental health system, for instance, really the federal government doesn't do a lot of funding for these services. This is mostly a state and local government funding issue, and so when you go from state to state, the amount of funding given to prisons and to criminal justice varies very widely, and we find oftentimes inmates are sent to lower cost facilities in other states, and Alaska, and I suspect this may have something to do with the fact that Alaska has incarcerated inmates in Arizona. I think we had stopped that. Now I know the the new governor had talked about reinstituting that process as a means of saving money. It's cheaper than building state prisons, and well, we'll touch on the private prison industry here a little bit later. But of course, the problem with this is that as prisoners get further and further away from their family, and you know, uh, contact with the people who love them and who they love becomes more and more difficult. Now, here this says that the cost of imprisoning a person annually is about $22,000. They are talking about adult inmates here. Seems kind of low to me, but that's the figure that the text gives us. Now, even though personal and property crime rates have been falling in the United States over the last few decades, the tendency of our system to incarcerate or either put on probation or parole it's increased dramatically during this period of time. So even though crime is falling, statistically, incarceration is increasing. In the table 14.3 in the text showed that in 2009, about 7.25 million people were either incarcerated or on probation or parole. Roughly 90% of those people were male. About 2/3 were minorities of color, and about half of all the inmates were African American. And I believe African Americans represent what 16, 12, 13, 16% of the population as a whole. So they're vastly overrepresented in the in the prison system. In 2002, 12%. What is that? About 1 in 8 African American men aged 20 to 34 were incarcerated. The statistics are very they don't line up real well because some of them are from 1 year, another is from a decade later, and that has to do with when these crime statistic studies are published and conducted and things like that. And unfortunately, they're not consistent. It doesn't show you a consistent snapshot across any 1 year, much less very recently. But this gives you a notion of what's going on, and it's pretty much the same at the moment, I'm sure. Hate crimes is mentioned also, and they're classified in categories based on race, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and disability. There are efforts underway, of course, in the present day, to include gender identity also in different places. In Indiana, it's interesting, that the hate crime bill was passed in 2019 with great debate about which groups would be identified, and it wound up not including specifically hate crimes based on age, gender, or gender identity. The other categories were there, but those three were not mentioned. And some of the advocacy organizations that were very upset about that. Indiana was one of 5 states at the time that did not have some form of hate crime legislation, and so the governor was pushing very much for something to kind of raise the image of the state, I imagine. Now it's interesting that there's a UAA professor quoted here from a KTUU website that said that hate crimes in Anchorage and Alaska in general was virtually non-existent statistically speaking. That site says something about 4 hate crimes being documented in Wasilla, Anchorage, and one other community in the state, but that none of them were included in the federal crime statistics because they didn't meet the criteria to be considered a hate crime. So this is difficult for me to imagine, and I think this has to do with reporting more than anything else. And this professor does say it's probably underreported, and I think that's certainly the case here because I think hate crimes occur in Alaska just as much as they do anywhere else. In fact, I think from this, the reading the news, we get that impression as well. In 2013, out of about 6,000 documented hate crimes, the FBI reported that about half of them were motivated by race, about 1/5 of them were based on sexual orientation, and almost 1/5 of them were due to religious bias. This is another thing I'm inserting here. It's not in the text, but I think relates to criminal justice. And when we talk about the intersection of the criminal justice system and racial minorities in particular here, the subject of driving while black must come up. And I would imagine you have heard of this, that if you're driving down the road and you're black, you're more likely to get stopped. And there have been study after study after study that's demonstrated that. And in the state of New Jersey some years ago, in fact, New Jersey State Police along the Garden State Parkway, that's their turnpike, knew that a study was going on that was, assessing whether they stopped black people more often or not. They still stopped black people far more often than any other group, and oftentimes not charging them with crime. But this is an issue with law-abiding black and Hispanic drivers in particular. In Arizona, it's an issue also with the Hispanic drivers. The sheriff Arpaio in Phoenix, I believe it was. In the county, Mesa County, I believe. Authorized his deputies to stop Latinos to make sure they had papers that had a right to be there, that kind of thing. That says black motorists are pulled over by police at rates exceeding those for whites. Many minorities see the troubling message, "You don't belong here." This is from a National Geographic website last year. They took a look, I guess, in states where this data was available. So again, the number of states varies. And if you go to this website, you can see the graphs. It's very interesting to look at these graphs. In 19 of 24 states where this data was available, black Americans were more likely to be stopped than whites if they're driving. After they were pulled over, black Americans were more likely to be searched in all but one state, even though they are no more likely to be carrying illegal substances. Black Americans were more likely than whites to be ticketed after a stop in all but 2 states, and black Americans were more likely than whites to be arrested after a stop in all of the states in that one particular group that was studied. Now, this kind of ties into some information that was also in our chapter on deviance, I believe it was, in my introductory sociology textbook that I taught out for years, that pointed out that, well, if you were black, you were more likely to be stopped by police. And if you were stopped, you were more likely to be charged. If you were charged, you were more likely to be incarcerated. If you were incarcerated, you were more likely to be held. And that has a lot to do with the availability of bail, I believe. If you're jailed when you go to trial, you're more likely to be convicted. And so the blacks are more likely to be convicted if jailed. If convicted, they're more likely to be sentenced. And if sentenced, more likely to be sentenced to death. And I believe if on death row, more likely to be executed. They're every step along the way in the criminal justice system, if you're an African American, you have a tougher time getting through that system. And these are statistics that show us this, and so these are things that it's really very difficult to deny the existence of racism in a system that can produce data like that. Turn our attention to juvenile justice for a little bit. Diversion is really probably the most effective way to keep kids from becoming adult offenders. Time and time again, it's been shown that children that are institutionalized in youth facilities are more likely to become more serious adult offenders. There's the text talks about the administrator in Massachusetts back in the late 1960s who reformed the Massachusetts system, and he went on to become quite an advocate for prison and criminal justice reform. For that, he made his career of this. He was quite famous, in fact, for it. But he shut down virtually all the youth facilities in the state, and to a great deal of anger on the part of the populace, I suppose. And yet, in those areas, those Massachusetts districts with strong community-based alternatives to institutionalization, recidivism was found to be much lower. He was looking at statistics also that showed that institutionalization more likely resulted in them being serious offenders. And when he tried to implement, actually what he tried first to do was to implement new policies about how they were treated, and met resistance from the guards and from the administrators of the prisons themselves. And so that's when he decided the only alternative, the only humane thing to do was to shut the prisons, to shut the youth facilities down. And so he wound up doing that, and it's a very interesting story if you want to read more about that. Now, another thing that's been very popular, and Alaska has its own, the boot camps, and goodness knows, when the number of difficult adolescents that we worked with in the mental health, when I worked in the mental health center, and in DFYS or OCS in Kenai, and oftentimes the custodians, the parents, kind of pushing for the child's enrollment in the military camp, and that this was going to be the thing that would, particularly boys, straighten them out, and things like this. And the studies have shown that really there's like virtually no impact one way or the other on the likelihood of future offenses by most of these boot camps. So it's I think they're becoming less popular nowadays, and certainly there have been some instances, really, not only in boot camps but in facilities all over the United States. The offenders that have been incarcerated have been the subjects of physical and sexual abuse and emotional abuse, and solitary confinement for long periods of times and things like this in facilities all around the United States, all around the U.S. And so efforts, have been made to tighten up, on juvenile delinquency, and to start trying more and more of them as adults, putting them sometimes in adult prisons, mixing with adult offenders, and again, studies have demonstrated that youth who are incarcerated as adults were 33% more likely to be rearrested for another crime later. So these community interventions, alternative interventions that provide juveniles and families more intensive services, are the things that have shown the positive results and the reduction in criminal activity, and is likely the direction that for policy changes, if necessary, that studies indicate would be the best way to go. Now, when we look at drug activity and arrests are concerned, again, black youth, and this has improved over past years according to the text, but still black youth are 45% more likely to be arrested than white youth for drug activity. Another issue of concern is for Native American youth. There are no facilities for felons who are Native American, and so they wind up getting put in with adults frequently. And for those Native American youths who are incarcerated in federal facilities, for those who are incarcerated for misdemeanors, usually are jailed far away from the family and the community, and again, that cuts them off from their culture and their opportunity to maintain contact with their family. Here it says the average annual cost of a youth detainee is about $88,000 per head, which actually seems a little more realistic. But youth certainly going to be more expensive than adults for a number of different reasons. But the interesting thing is that a lot of times the youth that are incarcerated really pose little to no threat to public safety. A lot of times there's a push to get kids off the streets because they're a disturbance to the community, not a threat to the community. And the authors quote an expert in this area, says that as we persist in sending them to places where they are likely to be victimized and certain to be isolated, and from which they consistently emerge further disadvantaged, a formula custom made to send them back to prison again and again. If we look a little bit more closely at race and ethnicity in the system in general, and of course, as we know, these are deeply connected into the incarceration patterns in America, as we've been talking about. Institutionalized racism is evident in the legal system, and so the correction system, and this has led to what amounts to the subjugation of blacks that is very similar to their treatment during the eras of slavery and the Jim Crow era that followed for 100 years after slavery ended. Now, again, crime rates are falling, but more and more blacks are being incarcerated, and this system really marginalizes minorities permanently so that the economic system can be seen as more of a racial caste system rather than a class system. Once in this system, it's very, very hard to get out of it, and to get a job, and to have a normal life again. I heard a lecture one time about slavery, I believe it was. I don't remember what the lecture was about, but the speaker talked about how we ended chattel slavery in America, the property possession slavery, but that was replaced with economic slavery. That while the blacks are legally free, nonetheless, many African Americans are left in a situation where economically they're strapped and confined almost as sure as if they were still slaves by the economic system. More than half of all black men who drop out of high school go to prison at one time or another in their lives. Overall, there are now more people under correctional supervision in America, more than 6 million, more than were in the Gulag Archipelago under Stalin at its height. We've heard mention of the school to prison pipeline in class, and this in effect inducts many minority youth into the correction system. How the schools deal with minority youth has a lot to do with how they wind up not finishing getting their diplomas, not finishing their education, and oftentimes winding up in incarcerated. Black males are twice as likely to be arrested after altercations at school. Black males have a suspension rate of 20% compared to 7% for white males. Students are often expelled from school under zero tolerance policy for relatively minor infractions like, bringing an over-counter medication to school, disrespect to school staff, failing to abide by behavior codes. Now we're talking about expulsion here, not suspension, and expulsion implies permanent removal from the school system. Police presence in the schools seem to be contributing to these higher arrest rates, and more and more we see law enforcement in schools for varying reasons. And the criminal record that develops is going to either intrude upon or prevent the young person from being able to be hired into legitimate employment. It makes it much more difficult. And being incarcerated makes that even more difficult still. And so, their capacity to be economically productive, to get a regular job, and to contribute to, the world, and to have a family and to be able to support their family is just terribly disrupted. And the schools kind of have a bit of an investment in these expulsions because these tend to be kids that don't do well academically, and so their performance measures, they do better in these performance measures. Looking outside the schools and into the neighborhood, there are all sorts of sociologists that will give you different theories about how, children who grow up in these impoverished neighborhoods really are socialized into delinquent behaviors and an oppositional stance to authority. And families in these neighborhoods oftentimes have a parent who has been an offender, and studies show that kids in those families are more likely to encounter the juvenile justice system. The punishment that juvenile offenders then wind up having given to them will interfere in their ability to complete school and interfere in their ability to develop a foundation for their employment as an adult. And so kids really, have a lot of those opportunities that other children are going to have. These kids in these poor neighborhoods have those opportunities closed off to them, and so it's not surprising that they migrate to gang activities that provide them with some status and an opportunity to make money, even though it's outside the acceptable norms. And so they wind up getting arrested more and then have more sentences, and you can see the spiraling effect here. The scenario is as tragic as it is embedded in the social reality of its perpetrators and victims. So in the 80s, these neighborhoods, were marked by things like drive-by shootings, holdups, carjackings, random shootings, and it isn't just the 80s, but there was a bigger problem back in those days, and that during the Reagan administration, that's what led to the establishment, the initiation of this war on drugs, and a lot of efforts and a lot of funding being put towards the two-pronged approach was the interdiction of drugs at the border to interrupt the supply, and the treatment of addicts and users to diminish demand. But as we've touched on earlier in the semester, the vast majority of the resources have been focused upon interdiction and not enough on treatment by any stretch of the imagination. And so, and the interdiction efforts have been very unsuccessful according to most of the statistics that we hear. But still, drug-related arrests account for a lot of the increase in incarcerated persons. And here, statistics from prisonerhealth.org will tell you, in 1980 there were almost 41,000 people incarcerated for drug offenses in America. In 2013, this number had increased to 489,000. Also during the Reagan era, assistance to the cities were reduced for social services and things, and so and drug trafficking flourished during those eras, so the inner cities were deeply impacted. There are studies quoted in the text that show that the criminal justice system, the involvement of young African American males in cities like the District of Columbia, 42%, in Baltimore, 56% in 1991. Young African American males, I think 18 to 35 is the age group, were either in prison, jail, on probation or parole, out on bail, or being sought for arrest. 56% in Baltimore and 42% in DC. Now consider the next little bullet point, that research shows us time and time again that employers will avoid applicants who have been arrested, and that doesn't surprise any of us, I suppose. There are theorists who really see this whole concept of crime when you go back to the idea of deviance and minorities and persons in control. When you consider from that perspective, crime can be considered an attempt at this concept of crime, an attempt to control minority youth and minority males even. But the more conservative theorists will talk about behavioral poverty, that those who are chronically poor have this lifestyle that ensures continued poverty, and also attitudes that subvert the effectiveness of social programs that are implemented to try to assist. They at least these people separate the chronically poor from the transient poor, but really kind of writing off the chronic poor here, I think. William Bennett and a few others. Bennett was the Secretary of Education, I think, in the Reagan administration. He's written a number of books. He is a moralist, and refers to a moral poverty resulting from growing up abused and neglected at the hands of deviant, delinquent, or criminal adults. Now, while the notion of behavioral poverty, moral poverty, that some of that may kind of make a little sense to you when you think about it. Well, this may be true, but you understand that these theories really overlook the larger role that our institutions play in creating this and in perpetuating these conditions. And if indeed these conditions exist among the chronic poor and among those who are living in impoverished neighborhoods, that may be understandable given the way that the larger system deals with those individuals and manages the problems that exist in their lives. So really, we're blaming the victim in these theories. We're not really looking at structural reasons for the existence of these issues and these problems. So how do we get the underclass, the undercast, as someone mentions, refers to them in the text? How do we get them into the mainstream? And the text just touches on a few things, and these are some things for policy proposals for those of you that are interested in poverty and criminology and changing those systems. First of all, enhancing educational opportunity and improving inner city schools to meet educational standards. Now, when we talk about policies such as affirmative action, the focus is often on university admissions and getting hired, the young adults, and getting an opportunity to have a level playing field with those who have come from lives of privilege. My thought is that we're missing the boat when we don't really apply affirmative action policies to elementary schools and to middle schools and even high schools. That applying those policies in college and at the point of entering the job market or getting a better job, all very important, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but it's really kind of late in the game. And what we need to be doing is to applying policies early in life to assure that children have equal opportunities in education from day one. That we have good schools, we have good teachers that are paid appropriately, that we have the materials that kids need, that families have the support necessary to get kids to school and to support their education and to help them find a path to an adult life of success that is outside of the criminal world. That's where our affirmative action policies need to be focused, that maybe aren't focused today, and that's an area for policy intervention for us, I think. Other solutions suggested: increasing earned income tax credits for the poor, government-sponsored employment programs. They talk about the WPA, but really more like the CCC and the NYA, the National Youth Authority, and the Civilian Conservation Corps were the jobs that really employed young people. But in the Great Depression, gave them jobs and got them working, and then improved the nation, through a number of different projects that they were big projects that they were developing national parks and things such as that, and the WPA was really kind of using, putting the talents of individuals to work, all sorts of different talents and everything, and creating infrastructure, building up infrastructure. And so those kinds of programs in our inner cities, perhaps, and in the communities where that are impoverished, those communities employing, or those programs employing people from those communities, might be a way out also. And Juan Williams, who's a journalist who you hear from time to time on the radio and in the networks. I mean, he says that all these programs are nice, but what we really need is to find ways to empower the poor to help themselves. That's a little more vague, but he's right. But what do we do with that? How do we go about that? Those are some great areas for some attention for you. Lawlessness declines as rates of employment and marriage rise. Our prisons have become warehouses for offenders who were judged to represent the highest risk to society. And rather than rehabilitation and those other goals that we talked about, that developed for corrections early in this lecture, incapacitation has become the focus now of our prison system. Getting them out of the communities and keeping them there and not allowing them to do any more crimes. And private corporations, which has been a bit of a trend in prisons because they seem to run things more cheaply, and the text says that sometimes the facilities are better. That in fact there's a lot of disputation to to that assertion. I think you'll see that there have been some examples of some privately run prisons that have had horrendous conditions for their prisoners recently, in fact. And so, anyway, these private corporations running prisons, they have a financial stake in more and more and more criminals. So I'm sure they're lobbying. However that is, for tighter laws, three strikes you're out, and all those kinds of things to ensure that their facilities continue to have more prisoners fed to them. So the authors write about the prison industrial complex's triangle of government bureaucrats, private industry leaders, and politicians who work together to expand the criminal justice system. Our leaders define what is deviant. Our leaders define what is a law violation. Our leaders define how to deal with and respond to deviant behaviors and law violations. Our elected representatives are involved in that. We've heard talk about decriminalization and legalization of drugs, and we looked at Portugal, which I think in 2001 decriminalized all drugs and it began to define drug addiction as a public health concern rather than a law violation. And I think there's been some success in that. I think we want to study that more. But the text raises a good question. Of course, there are benefits to this in that it would free up funds for take funds away from enforcement. Let our law enforcement focus on more concerns that have a greater import to the community, perhaps, and put them towards prevention and treatment programs. Reduce the prison population and reduce the stigma associated with addiction, so that perhaps addicts will be more comfortable seeking treatment. But the text raises a good question about whether or not all drugs ought to be legalized or decriminalized, given that the particular kinds of problems that have come up with some drugs like crack cocaine, meth, and now opioids more recently, behind this increase in children being placed in foster care, it's a terrible situation, and perhaps overall legalization or decriminalization isn't the answer. Maybe targeted would be more useful. I think also there is an argument to be made as that legalization of even more substances just sends a message to the youth of our society that it's okay to seek recreation and relaxation through the use of substances when there are many other ways to go about doing that. Just something to consider. The text also talks about police violence, and we've talked a lot about the intersection of racism and the criminal justice system here. So not to beat a dead horse, I mean, this has certainly been in the news a lot, and particularly the focus has been on police violence involving young black men. So it's a national concern. Again, more of them, far more proportionally, being killed by police than the population would suggest is even close to equitable, if such a thing could be equitable. And it certainly does point to the need for training of law enforcement and non-lethal interventions, particularly in terms of substance abusers and the mentally ill. But the other concern, of course, is law enforcement safety. The persons who protect us and protect our neighborhoods have to be able to protect themselves as well, and so we have to balance all that out together. But the correctional system has become so expensive that other government obligations have had their funds limited as a result, such as education, and there are other areas as well. And so it's worth looking at finding new ways to deal with deviant behavior and criminal behaviors than continuing to increase incarceration of offenders, particularly those who aren't violent and don't really represent a threat to the community. There have also been some suggestions because and some movement, I believe, in this area to limit employers' access to criminal records so that when a person applies, at least when they get access to this information, that it not be on applications, so that if an employer is looking through an application and the person checks yes, they've been arrested for a misdemeanor or a felony, the application may get put in the pile and that person's not even interviewed. And there's been proposals to make that information available to them only after they're considering hiring that person, and have interviewed that person, and that person has had an opportunity to make their case. And there's something to be said for that. Of course, employers need to know whether or not the person is a risk, but where that information comes into the decision process is something that perhaps needs to be considered also. And finally, another area of possible reform is the prisons themselves, and it points to a couple of nations around the world that really have much more normalized living environments for inmates. But the text also says it's pretty unlikely the United States is going to get to a point where we'll be giving our inmates the kinds of circumstances that is described in those few paragraphs. So the text closes with the thought that humanizing corrections so that it is more congruent with community reintegration of inmates remains a primary challenge for advocates of prison reform. And I think that's a good way to focus our attention when we talk about policy and criminalization, is how to get these persons back into our society with capacity to contribute to our society positively again. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks. Goodbye.